The clock on the wall was the loudest thing in the room. It wasn't a fancy clock, just a plain white circle with black numbers and a thin red second hand that clicked its way around the face. Dr. Alistair Finch had sat in this office for 15 years, and he had never once really heard it until today. Click. The sound was sharp, final, like a door closing. He looked down at the single sheet of paper on his desk. The words were simple, medical, and utterly devastating. Glioblastoma multiforme, a grade IV tumor. In the language of his world, the world of biology, it was a fascinating, ruthless example of cellular rebellion. Cells forgetting their purpose, multiplying without order, consuming the very system that gave them life. In the language of a man, it was a death sentence. 6 months, perhaps 9. Alistair leaned back in his leather chair, the old leather creaking a familiar complaint. He looked around the room. It was a temple to order. Books stood in straight, silent rows on the shelves, organized not by color but by subject and author. His desk, aside from that one terrible piece of paper, was clear. A single pen sat parallel to a neat stack of blank grading sheets. On the wall hung a detailed diagram of a human cell, a beautiful, complex map of a tiny universe. He knew every part of it, every ribosome and mitochondrion. He had built his life on understanding it, and now, that very same life was being unmade by a flaw in its design. A strange, dry sound escaped his lips. It wasn't a laugh. It was the sound of air leaving a punctured lung. He was a biologist. He taught university students about the life cycle of the mayfly, which lives for a single day. He lectured on the annual decay of autumn leaves. He explained with clinical precision the inevitable breakdown of telomeres with each cell division, the very reason we age. He had built a career and entire identity on the fundamental truth that all life ends. He just never thought his own ending would come with a date stamped on it. His eyes drifted from the cell diagram to the one small, messy part of his office. It was the bottom shelf of his bookcase. There, nestled between a heavy botany textbook and a thesis on marine microbiology, was a small framed photograph. The frame was cheap, the kind a child might make. It was woven from colorful popsicle sticks now faded with time. In the photograph, a young girl with wild, sun-bleached hair and a gap-toothed smile was laughing, her head thrown back in pure, uncomplicated joy. Her small hand was clutching the hand of a much younger Alistair. He was smiling too, a real smile that reached his eyes, something he couldn't remember doing in years. That was Ilara, his daughter. That was 10 years ago, maybe 11. The timeline was fuzzy, blurred by the busyness of his career, by missed birthdays, by quiet dinners that became quieter over time. The last time they had spoken, properly spoken, was over a year ago. It was a short, strained phone call on her birthday. He had sent a check. She had thanked him. The silence that followed was heavier than any word they could have said. The clock kept clicking. Click, click, click. Each click felt like a tiny theft, stealing a second he would never get back. He stood up, his joints feeling stiff and old. He walked to the window and looked out at the university campus below. Students hurried along the paths, their backpacks slung over their shoulders, their lives a sprawling, chaotic experiment full of potential and uncertainty. He saw a young man and woman stop to talk, their body language easy and familiar, and a pang of something sharp and regretful twisted in his chest. Connection. It was the one variable in the equation of life he had never been able to properly quantify. He turned away from the window. The diagnosis was a fact, a biological certainty. He couldn't change it. But what could he do with the time that remained? He could write one more paper, but the academic world would spin on without him. He could try to mend things with Ilara, but the chasm between them felt too wide, the words too difficult. Then, an idea began to form. It was not a grand, dramatic idea. It was a quiet, methodical one, an idea that fit the man he was. He went to a cabinet and pulled out a brand-new, hardbound notebook. It was simple, with a dark blue cover and empty lined pages. He carried it back to his desk, placing it deliberately in the center of the polished wood. He picked up his pen, the one he used for grading important papers. He would write down what he knew. He would leave behind a record of the truths he had spent a lifetime learning. Not for his peers, not for his students, but for her. For Ilara, it would be his apology, his explanation, his legacy. A bridge made of words and facts stretching from his world of cold, hard science to her world of, well, he wasn't entirely sure what her world was anymore, but he hoped she would understand. He opened the notebook to the first page. The blank lines stared up at him, waiting. He took a slow, deep breath, the air feeling thin and inadequate in his lungs. He pressed the tip of his pen to the paper. 5 Biology Truths Gently Explained, he wrote at the top. The title felt right. It was a project, a task, something he could control. Now for the first truth. It had to be the most fundamental one, the one upon which all the others were built. His mind, trained for decades, went straight to the data. He thought of ATP cycles, of metabolic rates, of the second law of thermodynamics. He began to write, his handwriting neat and precise. Truth number 1. All life, from the mighty oak to the simplest amoeba, is a temporary, self-sustaining chemical reaction. It takes in energy, uses it to build and repair itself, and eventually the reaction slows and stops. Its most fundamental, unchangeable truth is that it ends. He put the pen down and read what he had written. It was correct. It was accurate. It was the pure, unvarnished truth of his profession. And it was utterly, completely hollow. It was the kind of truth he would write on a chalkboard for a room full of first-year students. It held no warmth, no comfort, no him. He looked again at the photograph of Ilara. He remembered the day it was taken. They had been at a park, and she had found a caterpillar, a fuzzy, slow-moving thing. She had been so careful letting it crawl onto her finger. "What will happen to it, Daddy?" she had asked, her voice full of wonder. "It will build a cocoon, my dear," he had explained. "Its body will change completely. It will become something new. It will become a butterfly." He hadn't told her that the caterpillar essentially digests itself alive inside the chrysalis. He had given her the gentle version. The version filled with magic and possibility. The diagnosis on his desk was the caterpillar digesting itself. The truth he had just written in the notebook was the cold, hard science of it. But the man, Alistair Finch, the father who had held his daughter's hand in the sunshine, wanted to write the butterfly. He picked up his pen again. He didn't cross out the first truth. It was still true. But beneath it on the next line he started writing again. His hand trembled slightly, not from the illness, but from the effort of writing something that came not from his brain, but from a place deep inside he had long forgotten. "But," he wrote, the word looking small and vulnerable on the page, "the purpose of the reaction, while it lasts, is to create light and warmth and complexity, to turn sunlight into a forest, to turn a single cell into a beating heart, to turn a quiet moment in a park into a memory that can last a lifetime." He stopped and looked at what he had written. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even particularly scientific. But for the first time since the doctor had spoken those terrible quiet words in that sterile white room, Alistair Finch felt a tiny, fragile spark of something that felt a little bit like peace. The project had begun, and it was already changing him. The blue notebook sat on Alistair's coffee table, and it was beginning to feel less like a project and more like a confession. For 3 days, he had tried to be the professor. He started with the easy, solid ground of biology. Truth number 2, all living things are made of cells. He wrote a full page on the difference between prokaryotes and eukaryotes, his pen moving with the steady confidence of a man lecturing to a hall of 100 students. But then, he'd made the mistake of looking up. His gaze had landed on the empty armchair across from him, the one with the slightly faded floral pattern. He remembered a night years ago when Ilara, then maybe 14, had curled up in that very chair. She was crying over a failed math test. He had stood there awkwardly from the doorway. "The human brain is a problem-solving organ, Ilara," he had said, his voice sounding strangely formal even to his own ears. "You simply need to analyze where your logic failed and recalibrate your approach." She had looked up at him, her eyes red-rimmed and full of a hurt he couldn't comprehend. She hadn't said a word. She just got up and went to her room, closing the door with a soft, definitive click. He had stood there, confused. He had offered a perfectly rational solution. Why was she angrier? Now in the silent living room, the memory was a sharp, physical pain in his chest. He looked down at his neat, precise writing about cell walls and nuclei. It was all true, and it was all useless. It explained nothing about the look in his daughter's eyes that night. He closed the notebook in frustration. This was impossible. He was a scientist, not a poet. He dealt in facts, not feelings. The next morning, he decided to escape the silence of his apartment and work in his university office. Perhaps the familiar surroundings of academia would bring back his focus. He walked through the biology department's halls, nodding at colleagues, the rhythm of the place a comfortable old coat. He settled into his desk chair, the notebook open before him. He would tackle the heart. Truth 14. The human heart is a muscular organ, he began, his pen scratching efficiently. Composed of 4 chambers, its primary function is to pump oxygenated blood throughout the circulatory system. He wrote about the sinoatrial node, the body's natural pacemaker. He described the powerful contractions of the ventricles. It was a perfect self-contained description of a brilliant pump, a masterclass in biological engineering. Satisfied, he went to put the cap on his pen. But his hand froze. The photograph of Alara, the one in the popsicle stick frame, seemed to be pulling at his attention. Her laughing face, the memory of her closed bedroom door. A different kind of truth, messy and uninvited, bubbled up from a place he had kept locked away. It was the memory of the day his wife Clara had told him she was leaving. They were in the kitchen. She wasn't angry. She was just empty. "I feel like I'm living with a ghost, Alistair," she had said, her voice quiet and final. A very smart, very kind ghost, but a ghost all the same. When she walked out, he had stood perfectly still, his hand on the cold granite countertop. And then a physical sensation had erupted in his chest. It wasn't a heart attack. He knew the symptoms. This was a crushing, aching pressure, a feeling of something vital being torn apart. For weeks afterward, it felt like a heavy, cold stone was sitting where his heart was supposed to be. He looked back at his notebook. A brilliant pump. The word suddenly seemed like a lie, a childish simplification. If it was just a pump, why did it feel like it was breaking when Clara left? Why did it feel like it swelled with pride when a 7-year-old Alara correctly identified a monarch butterfly? A pump didn't feel. A pump just pumped. His carefully constructed wall between biology and life was cracking. With a sigh that came from the very bottom of his lungs, he picked up his pen again. He didn't cross out the clinical description. That was still true in its own way. But underneath it, in the margin, his handwriting changed. It became less precise, a little shakier, as if he were writing in the dark. He wrote, "But it can break in ways that have no anatomical diagram, and no surgeon can stitch it back together." He stared at the new words. They felt dangerous. They felt true. This wasn't what he had planned. He was supposed to be creating a clean, logical list, a testament to his life's work. Instead, he was scribbling in the margins like a confused student. Every fact he wrote seemed to have a shadow, a personal story attached to it that he had spent a lifetime ignoring. He thought about the rest of his list. He had planned to write about DNA, the blueprint of life. But what was the personal shadow of DNA? The fact that Alara had his mother's eyes? The way she had inherited his own stubbornness, creating a chasm between them that was built from the same genetic material? He had planned to write about the nervous system, the network of electrical impulses that allowed for sensation and thought. But that would lead him to the memory of the last time he had hugged her, the feeling of her small back under his hand, and how he had pulled away too quickly, back to the safety of his work. He closed the notebook, the soft thud echoing in the quiet office. The project was no longer a simple task of transcription. It had become an excavation. To write each biological truth, he would have to dig up the corresponding human truth he had buried. He would have to confront all the times he had chosen the clean, safe answer of science over the messy, complicated reality of being a father and a husband. He was no longer just explaining biology. He was dissecting his own life, and he was terrified of what he would find. The notebook was becoming a dangerous place. Alistair found himself almost afraid to open it. For a week it sat on his coffee table, a dark blue accusation. He would walk past it, make a cup of tea, turn on the television for the noise, and try to ignore the pull of its empty pages. He was a man who had built his life on certainty, on facts that could be proven under a microscope. But this project, his 105 Truths, was unraveling all of that. It was forcing him to wander into the foggy, uncertain swamps of memory, and he felt completely lost. Finally, one rainy Tuesday afternoon, the silence in his apartment became too heavy to bear. He sat down with a sigh, the old leather of the sofa groaning beneath him. He opened the notebook. The last entry was his shaky writing about the heart. He took a deep breath and turned to a fresh page. He needed to get back on solid ground. He needed a fact he could trust. He decided on memory. Memory was biology. It was neurons and synapses, electrical pathways firing in the brain. It was a thing that could be measured, mapped, understood. He picked up his pen, its familiar weight a small comfort. Chapter 31. Memory is not a perfect record, he wrote, the ink flowing smoothly. It is a dynamic process. The brain does not store experiences like a video file. Each time we recall a memory, we rewrite it, editing it slightly with our current feelings and knowledge. This was good. This was safe academic territory. He was describing the hippocampus, the role of proteins in strengthening neural connections. He was explaining how a memory from childhood could feel different when you are an adult, because the adult brain is filtering it through a lifetime of other experiences. He was building a nice, safe wall of words. But then, as if a trap door had opened beneath him, a memory itself broke through. It wasn't a full story at first. It was a sensation. The warm, heavy weight of a small child sleeping on his chest. He was lying on this very sofa years ago. Alara couldn't have been more than 4 or 5. She had a fever, and she had fallen asleep on him, her little body radiating heat, her breathing a soft, wheezy rhythm against his neck. He remembered the feeling so clearly, a profound, terrifying, and beautiful sense of responsibility. He had stayed perfectly still for over an hour, afraid that the slightest movement would disturb her, would break the spell of her trust. The memory was so vivid it stole his breath. He could almost feel the weight of her now. He looked down at his notebook, editing it slightly with our current feelings and knowledge. His current feeling was a crushing wave of regret. The knowledge was that he would never get that moment back. The memory began to change, to rewrite itself right before his eyes, just as his biological truth stated it would. The warm, beautiful feeling of his daughter sleeping on him was now stained with the bitter knowledge of all the moments he had missed afterwards. The memory was no longer just a memory. It was a judgment. Another one surfaced, sharp and clear. Alara, maybe 10 years old, standing in the doorway of his study with a sheet of paper. It was a drawing for a school project, a diagram of a plant cell. She had worked on it for hours, coloring the chloroplasts a careful green. "Look, Daddy," she had said, her voice full of pride. "I made it just like in your books." He had been in the middle of writing a lecture, his thoughts tangled in a complex argument. He glanced up, gave the drawing a quick, distracted smile. "Very good, Alara. The vacuole is a bit large, but the nucleus is well placed." He turned back to his computer screen. "Now Papa's very busy." He didn't look up again. He didn't see her smile fade. He didn't see her slowly turn and walk away, the carefully drawn cell hanging limply from her hand. He only heard much later the quiet click of her bedroom door. Now, in the silent, empty apartment, that quiet click was as loud as a gunshot. He had been her world, and he had told her he was too busy for her drawing. He had offered a correction about a vacuole when what she needed was a hug. He had chosen the cold, hard fact of biology over the warm, living heart of his daughter. His truth of 31 was correct. Memory was dynamic. But he was learning that the editing wasn't just a neutral process. When you were facing the end of your life, the editing was done by regret. It highlighted every failure in bright, painful colors. It took the forgotten birthdays, the missed recitals, the quiet dinners, and wove them together into a single devastating story of his failure as a father. He looked at the notebook, at the clean, logical sentence he had written. It felt completely inadequate. It explained the how of memory, but it said nothing about the weight of it. With a hand that was no longer steady, he wrote beneath his clinical explanation. The words came out in a rushed, messy scrawl, as if he had to get them out before he lost his nerve. And so we become the editors of our own past. We cut out the parts that are too painful and highlight the ones we wish we could live again. But the cuts never really heal, and the highlights only make the dark parts seem darker. We are not the heroes of these stories we tell ourselves. We are the ghosts haunting our own lives. He dropped the pen. It clattered onto the coffee table, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. He wasn't just writing truths for Alara anymore. He was on an archaeological dig through the ruins of his own life, and with every layer of dirt he brushed away, he was finding more evidence of his own absence. The project was supposed to be his legacy, but with every word it was starting to feel more and more like an obituary for the man he should have been. The walls of his apartment were starting to feel like they were closing in. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was heavy, filled with the echoes of all the memories he was digging up. Alistair knew he couldn't stay inside with the notebook anymore. It was like being in a room with a mirror on every wall, and he was tired of looking at his own reflection. He needed to be somewhere with life that was simple, something he could observe without it asking him painful questions. He thought of the university greenhouse. He hadn't been there in years. It was a place for the botany students, a humid, glass-walled world on the south side of the biology building. He pushed the heavy door open and was immediately met by a wave of warm, damp air that smelled of wet earth and blooming flowers. The air was alive. It was a shock to his system after the sterile, recycled air of his apartment and office. Sunlight streamed through the glass ceiling, dappling the leaves of giant ferns and palms. He walked slowly down the central stone path, his hands in his pockets. Here the rules were clear: photosynthesis, respiration, growth. It was a world he understood. He found himself stopping in front of a table covered in small, vibrant green shoots in black plastic trays. A woman, perhaps in her late 50s, with strong, capable hands and hair streaked with gray, was carefully transferring a tiny seedling into a larger pot. She wore a canvas apron stained with dirt, and she was humming softly to herself. She looked up and saw him standing there.
"Can I help you?"
she asked, her voice friendly but direct. No, Alistair said, feeling oddly out of place. "I'm Dr. Finch from the biology department. I was just looking." "Ah, a theoretician," she said with a small, knowing smile. She didn't say it unkindly. "I'm Maria, the head gardener. We don't get many of you folks down here. You usually prefer your microscopes." Alistair gave a slight, uncomfortable nod. His eyes fell to the tiny seedling in her hand. It looked so fragile. It seems like a lot of work for something so small. Maria chuckled, a warm, earthy sound. "It's not work. It's a conversation." She finished patting the soil around the seedling and picked up a small wooden-handled tool. This little one here was a slow starter. Didn't want to break through the soil. I had to give it a bit more warmth, a little less water. It was telling me what it needed. I just had to listen. Alistair watched, fascinated. He had taught the principles of plant physiology for decades. He could draw the process of germination on a blackboard in his sleep. But he had never heard anyone describe it as a conversation. He looked around the greenhouse. It wasn't just a collection of specimens. It was a community. Vines reached out for sunlight. Moss clung to damp rocks, and everything was interconnected. It was messy. It was alive in a way his textbook diagrams never were. He came back the next day, and the day after that. He didn't say much at first. He just walked the paths, observing. He saw Maria talking to the orchids as she misted them, encouraging a stunted lemon tree, and carefully removing a single diseased leaf from a rose bush with the focus of a surgeon. One afternoon, he found her standing over a tray of what looked like withered, brown stalks. "These didn't make it," she said, noticing his gaze. "Aphids. I tried everything, but sometimes you just can't save them." She didn't sound angry or defeated, just accepting. She gently tipped the dead plants into a compost bin. "They'll go back to the earth. Feed the next generation. It's all part of the cycle." That night, back in his silent apartment, Alistair opened the blue notebook. He thought about the greenhouse. He thought about the tiny seedling and the dead stalks. He thought about Maria's hands, so gentle and sure. He turned to a fresh page. The words came more easily this time. Truth of 52. A seed contains everything it needs to become itself. It holds the entire blueprint for the plant it will become, the shape of its leaves, the color of its flowers. It is a perfect, self-contained packet of potential. It was a beautiful scientific fact, a miracle of DNA and stored energy. He paused, thinking of Maria placing that seedling into the rich, dark soil. He thought of the care she took, the specific amount of water, the perfect spot under the glass where the morning sun would hit it. He picked up his pen again and added, his writing steady and thoughtful. But a seed alone is not enough. It needs the right conditions to grow. It needs good soil, water, and light. It needs a gardener who understands that too much water can drown it as easily as too little can starve it. It needs protection from pests and storms. Without the right conditions, the potential inside the seed will never be realized. It will remain forever what it is and never become what it could be. He stopped writing. The sentence hung in the air. He wasn't just thinking about plants anymore. A powerful, almost physical image flashed in his mind. A little girl with sun-bleached hair holding a drawing of a plant cell. She was a seed. She was full of wild, incredible potential. For art, for laughter, for love. She contained the blueprint of a wonderful, unique person. And he, Alistair, had been her gardener. Had he given her the right conditions? He had provided the physical necessities, of course. A home, food, clothes, and education. But what about the rest? Had he given her the warmth of his full attention, or had he been a distant, cold sun? Had he given her the nourishment of his praise, or had he offered only corrections, like a pesticide that kills the bad but also harms the good? Had he protected her from the storms of childhood insecurity? Or had he been locked away in his study, unaware a storm was even brewing? The truth was a cold stone in his gut. He had been a careless gardener. He had been so focused on the perfect scientific blueprint of the seed itself, her grades, her logic, her correct use of a vocabulary word, that he had forgotten to tend to the soil. He had forgotten that a child, like a plant, doesn't need a professor. They need a gardener, someone to listen, to nurture, to simply be present. For the first time since he started this project, a tear escaped from the corner of his eye. It wasn't a tear of self-pity. It was a tear of profound, heartbreaking understanding. He finally saw the shape of his failure, not as a list of missed events, but as a fundamental misunderstanding of his role. He had thought his job was to explain the world to her, but his real job had been to help her grow in it. He closed the notebook, the image of Maria's gentle, capable hands etched in his mind. He had come to the greenhouse to escape the messiness of human emotion. Instead, he had found a different kind of truth, one that was rooted in the earth, simple, beautiful, and more painful than any memory. The world had started to feel thin, like a worn-out sheet. Alistair's morning routine, once a predictable ritual of coffee and the morning paper, was now a shaky performance. The steroids the doctors had given him to control the swelling in his brain made his hands tremble. He would stare at his coffee cup, watching the liquid inside quiver, a tiny, nervous sea reflecting his own inner state. He had tried to ignore it. He was a man of the mind, after all. But the body has its own stubborn truths. The fatigue was the worst. It wasn't the normal tiredness after a long day. This was a heavy, deep exhaustion that seemed to seep from his bones. Some afternoons he would sit down in his armchair just to rest his eyes for a moment, and would wake up 2 hours later with the gray light of dusk filling the room. Disoriented and lost, he knew he had to keep going with the notebook. The days were slipping through his fingers like sand. He sat at his desk, the blue cover feeling heavy. He decided to write about something fundamental, something he knew inside and out, the process of life itself. He gripped the pen tightly, trying to steady the tremor. He began to write. Truth number 67. Cellular division is a dance of perfect fidelity. A single cell divides to become 2 identical copies, each one a perfect replica of the original. This is how we grow, how we heal. This process, called mitosis, is the engine of life. His handwriting was messier than usual, the lines wobbling. He continued falling back into the comfortable language of a lecture. But the process is not flawless. With each division, tiny errors can creep in. The telomeres, the protective caps on the ends of our chromosomes, get a little shorter. Over time, these errors accumulate. The copies become less perfect. The engine begins to wear out. We call this aging. He put the pen down and looked at his hands. They were covered in the faint brown spots his father had called liver spots. He saw the thin, papery skin, the blue veins mapping out the history of his body. He was a living example of his own truth. The errors had accumulated in him, not just in the slow, gentle process of aging, but in a sudden, violent rebellion. The tumor. The truth on the page was clean, logical. It was a perfect biological explanation, but it felt like a lie because it didn't mention the fear. It didn't mention the way his heart would pound when he woke up in the middle of the night, disoriented, the reality of his diagnosis crashing down on him all over again. It didn't describe the frustration of dropping a spoon because his fingers wouldn't obey him. He thought about calling Alara. The desire was a physical ache, a pull in his chest stronger than the tremor in his hands. He picked up his phone, his thumb hovering over her name in his contacts. His heart hammered against his ribs. What would he say? "Hello, Alara, it's your father. I'm dying. Also, I'm writing you a notebook." It sounded absurd. The chasm between them felt wider than ever, and now it was filled with this terrible medical truth. He lost his nerve. His thumb moved away and he put the phone down, the screen going black. The silence in the room felt like a judgment. He looked back at the notebook. The words "errors accumulate" seemed to blur on the page. They weren't just about his cells anymore. They were about his life. Every missed recital was an error. Every time he had chosen work over a family dinner was an error. Every time he had offered a correction instead of comfort was an error. These errors had accumulated too. They had created a different kind of breakdown, not in his body, but in the most important relationship of his life. The biology was about his body failing. But this other failure, the failure of his heart, felt so much worse. With a sigh that seemed to come from the bottom of his soul, he picked up the pen again. The shaking seemed to get worse, as if his body was resisting what he was about to write. He ignored it and pressed the pen to the paper, his writing becoming a desperate, jagged scrawl beneath the neat scientific text. But the most painful adaptations are not physical, but emotional. The body learns to live with pain, with fatigue. But the heart does not know how to adapt to regret. It does not learn to live with the silence where a daughter's laughter should be. These are errors for which there is no cellular repair. They are the true unwritten causes of decay. He dropped the pen as if it had burned him. He was breathing heavily as if he had just run a long distance. He felt raw, exposed. The notebook was no longer a project. It was a wound he kept reopening. He pushed himself away from the desk and stood up, his body feeling old and heavy. He needed air. He needed to get out of this room with its ghosts and its terrible, accumulating truths. He didn't know where he would go, but he knew he couldn't stay here, alone with the shaking of his own hands and the deafening sound of all the things he had never said. The greenhouse had become his refuge. When the four walls of his apartment felt like they were whispering his mistakes, and the silence became a roaring in his ears, Alistair would walk the stone path to the glass building, push the heavy door and breathe in the damp, living air. For a few days he had been avoiding it. The shame from his last entry in the notebook, the admission of his emotional errors, felt too fresh. He felt like Maria, with her kind, knowing eyes, would be able to see it on him, a stain he couldn't wash off. But the trembling in his hands was worse today, and the fatigue was a lead weight in his limbs. He needed the green, growing silence of the plants. He found his usual spot, a quiet bench tucked between a towering fiddle-leaf fig and a collection of ferns. He just sat, watching the dust motes dance in the shafts of sunlight. He must have closed his eyes because the next thing he knew, a gentle touch on his shoulder startled him awake. He jerked upright, disoriented. Maria was standing there, her head tilted in concern. "Alistair," she said, her voice soft. "You've been asleep for almost an hour. I didn't want to wake you, but are you all right?" He rubbed his face, his skin feeling papery and cold. "Yes, I'm fine. Just tired." The words came out automatically, a weak defense Maria didn't push. She didn't accept his answer either. She simply sat down on the bench beside him, not too close, but close enough. She looked straight ahead at the ferns, giving him the space to not have to meet her gaze. "You know," she said, her voice conversational, "this philodendron here." She pointed to a vigorous plant with heart-shaped leaves climbing up a mossy pole. "When I first got it, it was struggling. It had a fungus. I had to isolate it from all the other plants. I had to cut away almost half of its leaves. It looked so sad and bare." Alistair looked at the plant. It was now lush and vibrant, a deep, healthy green. "Why didn't it die?" he asked, his voice rough with sleep. "Because it wasn't alone," Maria said simply. "I checked on it every day. I made sure it had the right light, the right food. I talked to it. It's a living thing." It knew it wasn't abandoned. It fought because it felt supported. She turned to look at him then, her gaze steady and without pity. "You've been coming here for weeks, Alistair. You walk these paths like a ghost. You look at my plants with the eyes of a man who understands how they work, down to the last molecule, but you don't see yourself in them." Alistair's throat felt tight. He looked down at his trembling hands clasped in his lap. The silence stretched, but for the first time it wasn't an empty silence. It was a silence that was waiting for him to fill it. "I'm sick, Maria," he whispered. The words were so quiet he barely heard them himself. but saying them out loud to another person felt like a dam breaking inside him. It's in my brain. They can't fix it. He expected her to gasp, to offer empty words of sympathy, to tell him she was sorry. She did none of those things. She simply nodded, her eyes holding his with a deep, unwavering calm. "I see," she said. "That is a very heavy thing to carry by yourself." And that was all. There was no drama, no panic, just a simple acknowledgement of his truth. In that moment, her quiet understanding felt more powerful than any medicine. He found himself talking. The words started to tumble out, hesitant at first, then in a steady stream. He told her about the diagnosis. He told her about the notebook, about the 105 truths he was trying to write for his daughter. He told her about Alara, about the popsicle stick frame and the chasm of silence between them. He even confessed the fear that the notebook was just another selfish academic exercise, too little, too late. Maria listened. She didn't interrupt. She just listened, her hands resting in her lap, her presence a solid, calm anchor in the storm of his confession. When he finally fell silent, exhausted and empty, she spoke. "You write about biology," she said. "You write about cells and hearts and seeds. But have you written about symbiosis?" Alistair blinked. Symbiosis, of course. It's a biological relationship where two different organisms live in close physical contact. Maria smiled, a small, gentle curve of her lips. "It's more than that, Alistair. Out there in the wild, it's the rule, not the exception. A fungus and an alga come together to become lichen, something entirely new and more resilient than either could be alone. A bee and a flower, one needs pollen, the other needs to spread it. They need each other to survive." She gestured around the vast, humid greenhouse. "This whole place is a lesson in connection. Nothing here truly thrives in isolation. Not the plants, not the insects, not the fungi in the soil, and not people." She placed a hand gently on his arm for a moment. "You think your truth is that you are ending. But maybe the truth you need to learn is that you don't have to end alone." She stood up, her work here done for now. The philodendron didn't heal because it was strong. It healed because it was connected. Remember that. She walked away, leaving him alone on the bench. But for the first time since he had received the diagnosis, Alistair did not feel alone. He felt the truth of her words settle deep inside him, not as a biological fact, but as a lifeline. He looked at the thriving philodendron, at the way its leaves reached for the light. He thought of the notebook waiting for him. He had been trying to build a bridge to his daughter all by himself, from one isolated island to another. But Maria was right. A bridge needed support from both sides, and maybe, just maybe, he needed to let someone help him build it. He pulled a small notepad from his pocket, one he used for quick plant observations. He didn't write a full truth, just a note to himself, a single line that felt more important than anything he had written so far. Truth, 84. No organism truly thrives in isolation. We are all lichen. The conversation with Maria had changed something in the air he breathed. The heavy loneliness was still there, but it now had a small warm crack in it, letting in a little light. He had admitted his truth to another person, and the world had not ended. Instead, he felt a little lighter, as if he had put down a bag of stones he didn't even know he was carrying. He sat at his desk, the blue notebook open before him. The last entry was his messy scrawl about emotional decay. He turned to a fresh page. His hand was still a little unsteady, but his mind felt clearer. He wasn't thinking about grand, universal truths anymore. He was thinking about his daughter. He picked up his pen. He wasn't going to write a truth for the notebook. Not yet. He was going to write a letter he knew he would probably never send. "My dearest Alara," he began. The words looked strange on the page. So formal, so distant. He scratched them out. "Alara," he started again. He stared at her name. Just writing it felt like an ache. He took a deep breath and let the words come, not as a professor, but as a father. "I am writing this because I don't know how to say it out loud. I have never been good with spoken words, as you know. They seem to get tangled up between my brain and my mouth, and the wrong ones always come out. I have been thinking a lot about biology lately. I suppose I always do, but I have been thinking about one rule in particular, the most basic one. The primary biological imperative of any living thing is to pass on its genetic code, to create offspring, to ensure that a part of you continues into the future. For so long, I think that is what I thought being a father was. I provided for you. I made sure you were safe and healthy. I saw you as my legacy, my genetic code walking around in the world. I was so focused on the science of it, Alara, that I completely missed the heart of it. He paused, his pen hovering over the paper. This was harder than any academic paper he had ever written. I see now that a parent's job is not just to propagate their DNA. It is to help that DNA become a person, a wonderful, unique, separate person. It is to look at your child and not see a smaller version of yourself or a project to be perfected, but to see a whole new universe, with its own stars and its own weather. I failed at that. I was so busy trying to explain the world to you that I forgot to listen to you discover it for yourself. I corrected your drawings when I should have just put them on the refrigerator. I gave you logic when you needed a hug. I saw you as my legacy when I should have simply seen you as my daughter. I am trying now in my own clumsy way to do better. I am writing a notebook for you. It's called 105 Biology Truths Gently Explained. But it's not really about biology. It's about me. It's about all the things I learned too late. It's my attempt to finally see you and to finally show you who I am. He stopped. His eyes were stinging. He wiped them with the back of his hand, a rough, quick motion. I don't know if any of this makes sense. I don't know if you will ever even read this letter. But I needed to write it. I needed to tell you that you were never just my genetic code. You were and you are the most beautiful and complex reaction I have ever witnessed in my entire life. He signed it simply, Dad. He didn't write, "Love, Dad." The word felt too small and too big all at once. It felt like something he hadn't earned the right to write. He read the letter over. It was messy. It was imperfect. It was full of regret, but it was the truest thing he had ever written. He folded the paper carefully once, then twice. He didn't put it in an envelope. He didn't address it. He simply opened the blue notebook to a page near the back, and he slipped the folded letter between the pages. It disappeared, a secret hidden among all the other truths he was collecting for her. It was a message in a bottle, tossed into a sea of paper. He had no idea if it would ever reach its shore. But the act of writing it, of putting those raw, honest words onto paper, had changed something inside him. The project was no longer just an explanation. It was an apology. It was a confession. It was a hand tremblingly held out across time and silence. He closed the notebook, the hidden letter making the cover bulge just slightly. He felt a strange sense of peace. He had finally written the words he had been most afraid of. And in doing so, he had written his most important truth yet. Not with a number, but with his whole heart. The phone rang, a sharp, electronic trill that shattered the afternoon silence of his apartment. Alistair jumped, his heart giving a painful lurch. No one called him. It was usually a wrong number or a reminder for a doctor's appointment. He picked up the handset, his grip unsure. "Hello? Dad?" The voice was a woman's, clear, a little hesitant. It was a voice he hadn't heard in over a year, but he would have known it anywhere. It was Alara. For a moment he couldn't speak. The air seemed to have been sucked out of the room. He could hear the faint static on the line, a vast ocean between them. "Alara," he finally managed, his own voice a dry croak. "Hello. I'm in the city," she said. There was a pause, as if she were choosing her words carefully. "There's a work conference. A design summit. It finishes tomorrow. I was wondering if you'd like to meet. For a coffee, maybe?" Alistair's mind went completely blank. All his carefully constructed truths, all the words in his notebook vanished from his head. He felt like a computer that had been unplugged. "Yes," he said too quickly. "Yes, of course. That would be good." They arranged to meet at a quiet cafe he knew, not far from the university. When he put the phone down, his hands were shaking worse than they ever had from the steroids. It wasn't the illness now. It was pure, undiluted fear. The next day he stood in front of his wardrobe, staring at his clothes as if he'd never seen them before. What does a father wear to meet his daughter after more than a year of silence? He chose a simple, clean shirt, his fingers fumbling with the buttons. He arrived at the cafe 20 minutes early. He chose a table in the corner away from the window and ordered a black coffee. He watched the door, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He felt like a young man on a first date, terrified of saying the wrong thing, of being a disappointment. And then she was there. She pushed the door open, and a shaft of afternoon sunlight lit up her hair. She was taller than he remembered. Her hair was shorter, styled in a modern sharp cut. She looked like a successful, confident woman, a stranger. And yet, when she turned and her eyes scanned the room, he saw the same little girl from the popsicle stick photograph. She saw him. A small, tight smile touched her lips. She walked over, her footsteps quiet on the wooden floor. "Hi, Dad," she said, slipping into the chair opposite him. "Ilara," he said. "You look, well, thank you." "You too." It was a lie, and they both knew it. He looked thin and tired. The silence descended, thick and heavy. It was filled with all the things they weren't saying. The missed birthdays, the unreturned calls, the notebook sitting on his coffee table at home. A waiter came, and Ilara ordered a tea. The small interruption was a relief. "So, a design summit," Alistair said, grasping for the safest topic he could find. "That sounds engaging." "It is," she said, nodding. "It's about user experience, making technology feel more human." She spoke for a minute or two about her work, her words careful and polite. Alistair listened, but he wasn't really hearing the details. He was watching her face, the way her hands moved when she talked. He was searching for a crack in the polite wall between them. His coffee cup was empty. Her tea arrived. The conversation began to stall again, the safe topic exhausted. The silence was returning, and this time it felt final. This would be their last meeting. A polite, painful cup of coffee between two strangers who shared a name. Desperation began to claw at him. He couldn't let it end like this. He had to say something, anything that was real. "Did you know," he began, his voice sounding too loud in the quiet cafe, "that the monarch butterfly migration is one of the most incredible phenomena in the natural world?" Ilara looked at him, her expression unreadable. "What?" "The monarchs," he said, leaning forward slightly. "The ones that hatch in the late summer and autumn. They're different from their parents. They're born to travel. They fly thousands of miles from North America to a specific small forest in Mexico that they have never seen, a place their great-great-grandparents left. No one knows exactly how they do it. It's a map written in their genes. A truth they are born knowing." He was talking too fast. He was lecturing. He was doing the very thing he had always done. But he couldn't stop. It was the only language he had. Ilara was just watching him, her tea untouched. "They fly this impossible distance," he continued, his voice softening, "guided by an instinct they don't understand, to a home they've never known. All that struggle, all that effort, just to complete a cycle, just to ensure that the story continues." He stopped, out of breath. He had said too much. He had been weird and academic, and he had ruined it. He looked down at his hands folded on the table, waiting for her to make an excuse to leave. But then, a strange thing happened. A slow, real smile spread across Ilara's face. It wasn't a polite smile. It was the one from the photograph. It reached her eyes. "You remember," she said softly. Alistair looked up, confused. "Remember what?" "The caterpillar," she said. "In the park. When I was little. You told me it would become a butterfly. You didn't tell me it would dissolve itself into soup first. You just told me the magic part." He stared at her. He had forgotten that. But she remembered. For a single, fleeting second, the wall between them wasn't just cracked. It was gone. In that moment, they weren't a dying father and a hurt daughter. They were just a man and a woman in a cafe, connected by a shared, sun-drenched memory of a caterpillar in a park. It only lasted for a heartbeat. The moment passed. The wall settled back into place, but it felt thinner now, more transparent. The coffee was finished. The meeting was over. They walked out of the cafe together and stood on the sidewalk. "It was good to see you, Dad," Ilara said, and this time it sounded like she meant it. "You too, Ilara," he said. "Please, travel safely." She nodded, gave him one last, long look, and then turned and walked away, blending into the crowd. Alistair stood there for a long time, the city swirling around him. He hadn't given her the notebook. He hadn't mentioned his illness. He had talked about butterflies. It hadn't been the grand reunion he had imagined, but as he began the slow walk home, he replayed the moment of her real smile in his mind. It was a small thing, a tiny fragile connection, But in the complex, struggling ecosystem of their relationship, it felt like a single, resilient seed had finally found a patch of sun. It wasn't a forest, but it was a start. The cafe, the conversation, the fleeting smile, it all played on a loop in Alistair's mind for days. He felt a strange mix of hope and a deeper, more profound fear. Hope because a thread of connection, however thin, now existed between him and Alara. Fear because he knew his time to strengthen that thread was running out. The symptoms were no longer something he could ignore. The headaches were more frequent, a dull, persistent throb behind his eyes that the medication barely touched. The world sometimes swam at the edges, and he had started to forget small things, where he put his keys, a colleague's name. Each lapse was a cold whisper, a reminder of the silent, growing shadow in his brain. He sat at his desk, the blue notebook open to the final blank page. The space for truth. Her 105 stared back at him, a silent, daunting challenge. This was it, the last one, the culmination of his entire project, his life's work, his apology, his legacy. It had to be perfect. It had to contain everything. But his mind was a blank. He had written about cells and hearts. He had written about seeds and symbiosis. He had written about memory and migration. He had filled 104 pages with science and the shadows of his own life. What was left? What final grand truth could possibly tie it all together? He thought about the purpose of life. From a biological standpoint, it was simple: survival and reproduction. To eat, to avoid being eaten, to pass on your genes. That was the engine that drove the amoeba and the elephant. It was clean. It was logical. He could write that. But he thought of Maria, tending to her plants with a love that went beyond mere survival. He thought of the monarch butterfly, flying thousands of miles not for itself but for a generation it would never meet. He thought of the unsent letter to Alara, folded inside this very notebook, written not to pass on his genes, but to ask for forgiveness. His own life defied the simple biological purpose. He was dying. His chance for reproduction was long past. By the cold logic of biology, his purpose was fulfilled, or worse, it had failed. And yet here he was, fighting through the fog in his mind, trying to write one last thing. Why? He stood up, frustrated, and paced the room. His gaze fell on the photograph of Alara. He picked up the popsicle stick frame, his thumb tracing the faded, clumsy glue. He remembered her small, focused face as she made it for him. It was lopsided and the colors were a mess, but she had been so proud. In that moment, he wasn't thinking about his genetic legacy. He wasn't thinking about the biological imperative. He was simply filled with a feeling so vast and warm it almost overwhelmed him. It was love. Pure, simple, and utterly illogical. He thought of all the truths he had written. Every single one was about connection. The cell connects to become tissue. The heart connects to pump blood. The seed connects to the soil. The memory connects the past to the present. The butterfly connects one continent to another. Symbiosis is the ultimate connection. His entire project, without him even realizing it, had been a map leading to this single, simple point. He sat back down at the desk, a sense of calm settling over him. The pressure was gone. He wasn't trying to write the perfect grand truth anymore. He was just writing the last one. He picked up his pen. His hand was steady. He didn't write a long explanation. He didn't need to. He wrote just a few lines, his handwriting clear and sure for the first time in weeks. Truth number 105. The purpose of life is not merely to survive, but to connect. To be a temporary, self-sustaining reaction that gently and forever alters the chemistry of another. To be the soil for a seed, the sun for a leaf, the memory that brings a smile. That is the only legacy that matters. That is the only truth that lasts. He put the pen down. He was done. A profound exhaustion washed over him, but it was a clean exhaustion, the kind you feel after finishing a long, important journey. He had started this project to explain biology to his daughter. He had ended it by explaining himself to himself. He looked at the completed notebook. It was no longer an accusation or a ghost. It was a gift. It was the story of a man who learned, far too late, what truly mattered, but who had learned it nonetheless. It was his butterfly. It was his attempt to complete the cycle. He carefully closed the cover. The story of the 105 truths was written. Now there was only one thing left to do. He had to let it go. He had to trust that the connection he had poured into these pages would find its way, that the chemistry he had tried to alter would, in some small way, be changed for the better. The notebook was complete. It felt different now, lighter, or perhaps it was just that he had carried its weight for so long that its absence from his mind was a relief. For a day it sat on his coffee table, a closed blue chapter. Alistair found he couldn't look at it without a nervous flutter in his chest. The work was done, but the most difficult part still remained. He took a large padded envelope from his desk drawer. He slid the notebook inside. Its shape and weight were familiar, a part of him. Then he remembered the letter, the unsent folded confession he had tucked away weeks ago. He retrieved it, the paper soft at the creases. He held it for a moment, then slipped it into the envelope alongside the notebook. He needed to write something new, something to send with it. He took a single, clean sheet of paper. For Ilara, he wrote at the top. His pen paused. What could he say now that wasn't already in those 105 pages? What final word could he offer? The words came softly, not from his mind, but from a quiet, sure place that the entire journey had carved out inside him. All my love, contained in these pages. Dad, he signed it simply, but this time the word felt earned. It was no longer just a title. It was a promise, an apology, and a blessing all in one. He had contained his love in the only way he knew how, in words, in truths, in the story of his own awakening. He folded the note, placed it on top of the notebook, and sealed the envelope. He wrote her address carefully, his handwriting steady. Each loop of a letter, each number felt like a final act of connection. The walk to the post office was slow. The sun was warm on his face, and he noticed things he often missed. The determined push of a weed through a crack in the pavement, the complex chatter of sparrows in a tree, the sheer life of the city moving around him. He wasn't a part of its rush anymore, but he could appreciate its rhythm. At the post office, he handed the envelope to the clerk. It felt like handing over his own heart. The clerk slapped a stamp on it, tossed it into a bin with other packages, and mumbled, "Should get there in a couple of days." Just like that, it was gone. His life's final, most important work was out of his hands, traveling into the unpredictable system of the world, on its way to his daughter. A part of him wanted to snatch it back, to hold onto it for just a little longer, but he didn't. He turned and walked out, feeling strangely weightless. He didn't go home. He went to the greenhouse. Maria was there, of course, repotting a large flowering plant. She looked up as he entered, and she must have seen something in his face, a stillness, a resolution, because she didn't ask any questions. She just smiled, a small, understanding smile, and nodded towards their usual bench. He sat down. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and jasmine. He watched Maria work, her hands moving with a gentle certainty. He watched the light filter through the giant leaves, painting shifting patterns on the stone floor. He listened to the quiet hum of life all around him. He thought about the notebook now on its way to Ilara. He didn't know if she would read it. He didn't know if it would mend anything, if it would make her understand, if it would make her hurt less. He had no control over that anymore. And for the first time, that felt okay. The purpose had not been in the outcome. The purpose had been in the act itself. He had spent his life trying to control variables, to understand systems, to find definitive answers. But his final project had taught him that the most beautiful truths were not about control, but about release. A seed doesn't control the soil it lands in. It simply does its best to grow. A butterfly doesn't control the wind. It rides it. A father couldn't control his daughter's heart. He could only offer his own as honestly as he knew how. He had done that. He had offered his heart, contained in 105 truths gently explained. A deep sense of peace settled over him, warmer than the greenhouse sun. It was not a happy peace, not exactly. It was a peaceful peace. It was the quiet acceptance of a story well told, a connection well made, a life fully, finally, lived in its own imperfect way. He closed his eyes, breathing in the green, living air. He was just a man on a bench, in a world full of beautiful, temporary, self-sustaining reactions. And in that moment, it was more than enough.